Yeah, welcome to our Coaching in Context webinar. Today's date is February 15, 2023. My name is Dr. Okokon Udo. I'm the director of the Evidence-Based Coaching Program at Fielding Graduate University. I am joined today by our presenter, Sarah Smith, and I will be introducing her more fully momentarily. I request that you please keep yourself muted throughout the presentation. This webinar is eligible for CEUs through the ICF, and you need to be present for the presentation to receive that. Close to the end of the presentation, I will post a link, and I invite you to please endeavor to complete the survey within 12 to 24 hours after our presentation. After that, you will receive the CEU through the Office of the Registrar here at Fielding Graduate University. The recording will also be posted on the Evidence-Based Coaching page on our website. So I'm excited to introduce to you our presenter for today. During the presentation that you will be experiencing today, Sarah will draw on the psychological study of wisdom, showing how it can support ethical practice for coaches. We will turn the lens towards adult development, examining the topic from two paradoxical perspectives, raising ethical questions for individual coaches and the coaching field. The first perspective will describe how theories of adult development can support coaches in developing their own ethical, reflective practice. The second perspective suggests that an ethical, reflective practice requires coaches to question theories of adult development and the assumptions they are built upon, noting that even the concept of development itself is culturally situated and maybe problematic. During the presentation, we will not aim to resolve this paradox, but rather to provoke reflection and conversations that allow systemic ethical issues to surface. The presentation will also provide practical frameworks that can be applied immediately to enrich your professional reflective practice. So Sarah is an experienced coach with over 20 years of professional practice in developing individuals and teams across a range of sectors. She's a visiting lecturer at Cranfield University, has led international executive education and corporate programs, taught at post and undergraduate levels, and presented at international conferences. Her research focuses on the psychology of wisdom. She's engaged in doctoral research into this area at the University of Lincoln. This informs her approach. She brings a philosophical and deeply relational way of understanding the challenges of being human into her coaching work and clients. So Sarah, welcome, and I will now turn it over to you.
Oh, I realize I've muted myself. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so I will start by working out the technical stuff and get my slides shared. Right, am I sharing the entire screen or just my slides? I have a feeling I've clicked the wrong thing.
It shows up with your screen, and I think you
Let me try again. I think I didn't. There we go, this one. Is that better?
Yes.
Excellent, good. First successful technological thing achieved, so good. First of all, I want to start by saying a very warm welcome and thank you very much for giving up your time to come and listen to me talk a little bit about ethics, wisdom and adult development. I really appreciate it. It's lovely to see some very familiar faces and some long-standing friends and colleagues, as well as meeting some very new people who I'm delighted to see here as well today. So a very warm welcome. So we're talking today about ethics, wisdom, and adult development and coaching. And this first slide, I'm just going to flag the book just to the first right of the title, The Ethical Coach's Handbook, because the title of the talk today comes from a chapter that I wrote with my colleague, Roger Bretherton, which is published in this book, which is going to be available, I think, on the 8th of March. It's just coming out. We're just waiting for launch. And I was just saying to Okan actually before we started live altogether that when I took on the chapter, I thought it's a hugely ambitious set of topics to even attempt to cover in the space of one chapter. And then I realised when I'd agreed to volunteer to do this for the talk that then taking a step beyond that and thinking, oh, I can do something on that for an hour was perhaps even more foolish and ambitious. So I'll put that frame around it as we start today. So with that said, what I aim to do today is give you a little bit of a flavour of how these three different lenses, ethics, ethical maturity, wisdom, and adult development, might be relevant when we think about them together. And give you a little bit of a taste of what you might find if you want to go on and read the chapter, and or I've put in some further resources for places you can go and have a look if you want to engage in some of these topics more deeply. And at the very least, what I do hope it gives you is provokes a little bit of thinking and some reflection around what is the role of adult development in the way in which you work. And if you bring an ethical and a wisdom lens to that, does it start to prompt or provoke some questions you might not otherwise normally have thought of? So that's my hope for our session today. I also do hope that we get to be a bit interactive as well. So please do feel free to post questions in the chat or just, come off mute and ask me something if there's something that's unclear or you just want to probe a little further as I'm going through. I've built in a couple of pause points, and there might be a couple of sections where we may make use of breakout rooms or go off into pairs or something if we have time. We'll play it by ear and see how we're going. But I'd love for you to have the opportunity to apply some of this and put some of this thinking in practice during the talk today. So that is the sort of loose plan. With that said, I shall probably dive in. I'm going to fiddle around a little with my visuals so that I can see more of you, because at the moment I'm just dominated by, let me go to this view. That's much nicer. It's nice to see faces as well, isn't it, as just staring at your slides. So, okay, so whenever I start a talk on the topic of wisdom, which is the area that I particularly engage in, so it's the area of my current doctoral research and looking at the psychology of wisdom and its relevance in organizational contexts, it's an incredibly uncomfortable feeling in many ways. One of the things about studying a topic like wisdom is it feels almost completely inaccessible, as if it's this kind of aspirational thing that we might all be wanting to strive or reach towards, and at the same time completely out of reach. And of course, one of the things I know from the research work looking at wisdom is that thinking about it as something where we might move in and out of just being a little bit wiser on occasion may actually be a much more accessible way of thinking about it. But it brings with it, I think, this kind of notion of humility. And when you're tackling topics such as these, I think this sort of top quote, the Resnick quote, just always really sits well with me. It's this kind of feeling of how much you don't know every time you kind of increase your understanding or grasp of a particular topic or area. And this is maybe a bit of a theme as we go through the talk today, because one of the things I'm going to be doing is opening up things that seem like they don't sit comfortably together, which can provoke this sort of feeling as, yeah, but I want to know which is right or which is better. And what I won't be doing is proposing an answer to that. And that kind of is a central feature of wisdom, this sort of sitting with that discomfort that comes sometimes from ignorance, and being okay with holding both of those tensions at the same time. And the second quote I've put up here, Casey and Shola, is this idea that whenever we are saying something and we're sharing what it is we think or we know with others, verbally and through non-verbal ways in which we're communicating, that of course there are always other ways in which we know stuff. We know things with a lot more than our verbal ways in which we can express things. And sometimes one of the things we struggle with when we're trying to talk or explain ourselves to others is how to bring that into the room or into the conversation, and how to express that so that it can be understood between people. And every time we say something, that maybe changes a little because we're a little different. So I'm always very conscious of that as well when talking about these topics. So as I've already intimated, we're going to be touching on some of this. There is always going to be more than. So I thought it would be useful to share a little bit with you about some sort of opening context. So in terms of my research work and its relevance to my workplace settings and the coaching work that I do, is that I've been very focused on a particular driving question for probably about the last 5 or 6 years. It's been really sort of central to the work that I've been doing. And that driving question is this: why do we collectively produce results that nobody wants all the time? So I'm a firm believer that nobody wakes up in the morning and goes, today I want to increase inequality in the world, or today I want to exacerbate climate change and make sure that happens faster or worse. And yet we're kind of caught up in these traps whereby these are some of the outcomes that we seem to be producing. So these, completely unintended consequences are arising. And there's this kind of complex, entangled mess of stuff that we find it hard to unhook ourselves from in order to get any kind of perspective or traction on some of those problems. And of course, one of the things that is increasingly being recognised and asked maybe in the coaching field is, what part or what role might coaching have to play in this entangled mess? Do we have a part or a place to play in contributing to some of the untangling and tackling of some of the large-scale global challenges that we face? And how might we, as a coaching field, in an unintentional way, maybe be contributing to or part of some of the problems that are arising? So I think a really important part of this process that I want to sort of hold up to us today is this bit of how important it is for us to engage in a reflection upon ourselves, which sort of teases out ways we may be deceiving ourselves, and how we may be colluding with systems and ways of thinking and operating that may be completely unintentionally part of a problem. There are, of course, many different ways in which we are beginning to start to describe and understand what is going on that have very credible explanatory power. And bringing some of those perspectives into our work, I think, is a really important thing, as well as arguably actually quite an important ethical question. So, implications of this then for coaching. So one of the things that strikes me is that this then leads to what are some of the reflective questions that we might want to be asking of ourselves in order to try and avoid some of these unseen, unintended negative consequences. I do not think that these are the sorts of things that can be, fixed or ruled out. So whilst things like a professional ethical code are hugely important, and of course they absolutely are, they are not complete or will never be complete in addressing some of the ambiguous ethical issues that we may and regularly will and do encounter. So coaching by its very nature is kind of predictably unpredictable. It's sort of deeply relational. There are all sorts of psychological consequences. We work with individuals and with teams who are part of wider complex systems. We work with people that may be addressing it in the basis of a workplace context, and yet those individuals are also part of wider communities, families. So there can be kind of far-reaching interdependencies and consequences. And, self-deception, collusion, all of these things are inevitable in many ways. These are sort of almost features of what it means to be a human being and to come together and work together. So, as I say, my stance is that these are not things that can be ruled out. We can't eradicate them. So, better to ask a question, which is along the lines of, if these are features and are always going to be features of our work, how do we need to be thinking about our work, and what practices do we need to engage in that mean we're minimizing the likelihood of contributing to negative consequences? And this, I would argue, is where we move beyond the territory of kind of ethical practice and the basis of professional ethical codes into the importance of ethical maturity, and I would argue wisdom. And this quote from Robert Sternberg is maybe quite a powerful one, and certainly at the time in 2003, had a kind of a particular sort of impact. I would argue there's probably not so many people now that would even remotely disagree with this now. I mean, we're sort of 20 years on, and it seems even more urgently true than maybe it's 20 years ago when Robert Sternberg first stated it. That if there is anything the world needs, it is wisdom. Without it, I exaggerate not at all in saying that very soon there may be no world, or certainly a hugely affected one. So what I would like to do before I delve into sharing a little bit about what the psychological literature on wisdom has to say, I'm very interested in hearing a little bit first from all of you about what you think wisdom is. So with that said, I think probably the best way to do this is probably in the chat. So if you want to take a moment, what does wisdom mean to you? What do you think of when I talk about wisdom? Okay, so I'll wait a minute for a few to come in. Fabulous. I'm already thinking I need to save the chat. Is that it's the so some lovely things coming up here. So this idea of objectivity, so a kind of objective knowledge, being able to detach or disconnect from judgment or bias, or diminish or reduce that, learning from experience, multiple ways of knowing. So this has cropped up across for a few of you. So holding complexity and making decisions that serve the interests of a greater number, so broader perspectives, but also this being able to sit well with complexity and work with complexity. Well-considered application of knowledge, so not just having knowledge, but knowing when to and how to apply it, seeing broadly, taking multiple perspectives, comfortable with the unknown, discernment, I love that word, sound judgment, right thing, right time, right reason. So this bit about motives, what are our motivations that sit behind things? Anticipating, so this sort of looking forward, a sense of foresight or forecasting. Being and acting, so this idea of action as well as being, empathy and care. And wise elders, so this idea of wisdom that may be passed on, that may be learnings that have been garnered over a lifetime of experience that may get passed on and passed through generations. Fabulous. So all of those things are hugely supported by some of the thinking and work looking at wisdom. I'm going to share a little bit about what the psychological literature says. And of course, like I said at the beginning, this is a vast topic. So you are getting a very thin slice description here in the couple of slides that I've put together for you. but you'll see lots of echoes of what you have shared as well. So a sort of overarching definition, which is one that I come back to a lot when I'm talking to people about wisdom. I think it says a lot, despite being deceptively simple, that wisdom can be described as an adaptive capacity that enables us to live and act well in complexity. And Wendelin Coopers, who wrote this definition, also talks about wisdom as complexity understood. So this kind of orientation to being able to be with complexity, but also to act in complexity and to do that well, which implies this kind of motives, this idea of reflecting on what does it mean to live a good life? And what does that mean when we think about that across social groups, for example? So that adaptive capacity may involve several different aspects. So again, echoing quite a bit of what came up in your observation. So this balance and integration of multiple component parts. So integrating both cognitive dimensions, but also affective dimensions. So compassion and empathy, for example, and then reflective dimensions, being able to kind of step out of ourselves and look and reflect upon what is happening. And that those things are balanced and can be integrated, so we can draw on all of those different dimensions. And Sternberg talks quite a lot about this management of uncertainty, and uncertainty crops up as a really central theme in some of the work on wisdom. But this balancing and integrating of conflicting interests, and again, this has shown up a bit in some of your observations on the chat. So how do we balance and integrate different conflicting interests? And that we are doing that in such a way that there's a kind of constant adjusting, shaping, and that we're changing. So there's something very dynamic and almost improvisational about the way in which we are doing this, but that it is guided by a movement towards a common good. So there is a clear set of interests, if you like, that we're focusing towards. And of course, we could have a whole conversation about what do we mean by the common good. And then another important aspect of this, and again really came up in a lot of what you wrote in the chat, this bit about self-deception, so being able to step back from judgment and bias and constantly testing ourselves to make sure that we're seeing through illusion and self-deception. So we're deliberating on what matters most in life and thinking how that can be translated into choices and actions, but again that this is a process, so we are constantly revisiting that. Trying to see the world more as it is and less as we think it is. So this kind of grappling with a grasp, trying to have a grasp of reality. And I deliberately put this at the bottom. I was delighted when I saw it came up several times in the chat, because I think there can be a misperception that wise thinking or wisdom is very reflective in nature and may not be as focused in terms of action, and of course it absolutely is. Wise thinking and acting are arguably stitched together. Wise thinking is for wise acting. And there are several different perspectives that we could say show up when we look at what's happening when people are engaged in wise thinking. So almost a little bit like a kind of positive syndrome, that when these different perspectives come together and work together as this sort of positive syndrome, give us a particular lens on the world. And some of the main perspectives that wisdom research into wisdom suggests are things like self-transcendent, so this ability to be able to rise above ourselves and see this, this sense of connection and a connection to all things. And you can see how these work together somewhat as a kind of positive syndrome. So this wholeness, being able to take a holistic perspective, seeing what's hidden, patterns, themes, relationships, the way in which things unfold over time, which resonates with some of the observations you made about, being able to perhaps predict somewhat pathways and contributes to things like foresight. this balance, integration and balance, moving towards equilibrium, but also thinking, and I'm going to sort of just underscore this one for a moment because it will become relevant a little bit in a moment, this considering historical, situational and contextual factors. So paying credence to contextual orientation and contextual ways in which we know things. Paradox. So this idea that conflicting things can be simultaneously true, and of course we're particularly going to pick up this paradox lens in a moment. Complexity, as I've maybe already touched on sufficiently. Humility and uncertainty, so knowing that what you don't know as well, and recognizing the limits of that knowledge. And then centrally important as well, compassion. So this care and concern for the suffering of others, and compassion in that sense of, a motivation to want to relieve suffering. So when we think about these wisdom perspectives and we think about their relationship with ethics and ethical maturity and what that means in our professional practice, one of the things we can fairly swiftly see is parallels and connections between the ways in which we might describe ethical maturity. And some of you may be very familiar with these two different frameworks that I've shared on the slide here. I'm not going to go through them in a lot of detail, but I'm very happy to share the slides so you'll be able to read through some of this afterwards if you want to. But Carolyn Shaw's approach to describing ethical maturity, for example, you'll see a lot of resonance between those and some of the perspectives of wisdom that I've shared with you. And then similarly, when we start to look at Peter Hawkins and Eve Turner, so Peter and Eve's work looking at taking an ecosystem perspective. So what does it mean to look beyond and think about more than human stakeholders as well in the way in which we consider ethical issues in our coaching work? I love their phrase, wide-angled empathy, isn't that? I just think that's beautiful. But so you can see a lot of echoes, I think, and resonance between those. So when we think about bringing this wisdom lens, stroke an ethical maturity lens to the topic of adult development in coaching, I'm going to present it here particularly as a paradox, and I'm going to suggest that there are maybe two things that are both simultaneously true. One is that adult development theories, when we delve into them, may be absolutely beneficial in terms of supporting our ethical practice. So they may contribute in all sorts of valuable and helpful ways. And at the same time, I'm going to suggest, whoops, I'm back ahead too early, that theories of adult development and arguably even the concept of development itself may actually be problematic and may unintentionally be implied in what could be unethical practice. And that therefore, as coaches, we need to be able to take a step back and think about adult development and the developmental work that we're engaged in, and consider it maybe from both of these different angles and both of these different lenses. Of course, we could, and it's probably worth just noting that before I move on to delve into this a little bit more, we could bring this lens to other topics than adult development. I've particularly picked adult development here because I think it's one of the things that is maybe a somewhat provocative topic in terms of what it means for us as coaches, and is perhaps particularly relevant. So is an interesting, I think, and useful one to bring this lens to. But I would also suggest that this is the ethical maturity and wisdom lens is one that can absolutely be applied to other areas that are also very relevant to us as coaches. So this then raises a question of what does constitute developmental work? So if we think about developmental work in the context of coaching, what do you think it constitutes? I want to put a couple of ideas in the chat. I'll give you a moment. I'm interested in what comes to mind for you with this. Nice. Okay. Good. So this being constantly in motion, so cognizant that clients are constantly in motion, so that as human beings we are always in flux. So there's always a dynamic shifting that is happening. Um, certain adult development theories, for example, so some that maybe describe particular stages of development, for example, and that those might be about moving towards more and more complex ways of understanding the world, broadening perspectives, distancing, personal response, increasing. So this idea of increasing things like responsibility, resourcefulness. I like this. So as well as increasing, we've also got things like broader or deeper perspectives. So there's something about depth and breadth and a kind of increase and expansion, maybe. Applying, putting into practice. So actually being able to apply or act on things. Very nice. Yeah, so situationally relevant as well. So there may be something about an ongoing process of what's relevant here. So this kind of relevance realization process that may be going on, and that developmental work may also involve that process. So this process way of thinking. Fabulous. So all of those things actually, I think, are incredibly descriptive of the way in which developmental work shows up, and shows up for us as coaches. And one of the things that I wanted to flag about this is because on the one hand, there are coaches and coaching work that we might label, we may identify and describe ourselves as a developmental coach, or we may say that, as a coach, my work is in draws on or directly applies developmental theories, and or we may not. So some of us may not identify as developmental coaches. But one of the things I would argue is that regardless of whether or not you do that explicitly, that actually coaching nearly always is happening in contexts that are actually steeped in legacy developmental theories. That maybe the concept of development and some of the developmental theories that we have been around for many years, and heavily influence our workplace environments, for example, are contexts within which we are working. So they're kind of stitched into, or into the work that we're doing, even if it's something that we're not attending to directly. So it may be out of our mind, yet it may be relevant or central to the work that we're doing. So we're going to look at each of these two different perspectives then separately. And I'm going to give you, again, I'm going to go back to that bit I said at the beginning about this was maybe very overambitious to think I'd be able to sort of delve into both of these perspectives in full for you. So it's going to be a very light touch on each of these different perspectives, but will hopefully kind of tease and tempt you enough to sort of provoke some thinking and encourage you to go away and delve into some of this a little bit more. For some of you, you may already have a lot of familiarity with adult development theories. And it may be that you already are in touch with the whole body of work that I know sits underneath some of the things I'm going to be touching on. But a lot of what you've described in the chat here sort of echoes one of the key things I want to flag here about how adult development theories can be enormously contributing to the way in which we may think about ethical practice, and how we might develop ourselves and our own ethical maturity and wisdom as well. And that is the idea of thinking about development theories as a way in which they capture and reflect the process of development. So when we move away from content and what the adult development theories say we should or shouldn't be doing at X or Y stage, for example, if we think about a stage theory example of an adult development theory, and we move to think about adult development theories as capturing something about the process by which change happens, how we change, we can start to see how what might on the surface appear as incompatible different theories that are maybe grounded in very different paradigms or philosophical views actually have something really interesting to reveal about what it means to change as a human being. And when we hold those things together, there may be some particular lenses that we can bring and apply to our coaching reflective practice. So when we think about this, how people change, one of the things that shows up across different theories of adult development is with different degrees of relative importance being expressed. The centrality of particular tasks, these might be life tasks, for example, often triggered by certain dialectical tensions or crises or critical incidents that we might walk into. We might also find that roles are hugely central. So when we look at some theories of adult development, the importance of the roles that we take on is a vital part of how we go about changing. And also another category, and I'm not going to, I'll flick up in a minute a little bit of a summary of where some of the different theories maybe sit under some of these headings. But another category of adult development theories that perhaps particularly feature practices as being really central, arguably is a way in which we might transcend the importance of tasks, crises, and roles. So from this kind of cross-theoretical perspective, we can actually consider, let me go back for a moment, moving the wrong one, how these things work together and influence as a sort of dynamic system. So I'm not going to linger on this one because, as I say, I'm happy to share the slides so you can have a little look and see which maybe fall under the different categories. But I want to move fairly swiftly into how is this relevant for us then? What does this mean about how we might practice and reflect as coaches? So what I would like to offer you the chance to do is, and this will be a fairly short little bit of a taster of a reflective exercise, is thinking about a particular recent or current coaching relationship or piece of work that you were involved in, and thinking about it through the lens of tasks and crises, roles and practices. I've populated here a couple of questions. In the chapter in the book, there's a whole table of kind of reflective practices that fall underneath each of these different areas, but that was far too much to share with you today and be useful. So I've just picked a couple here. So what I'd like you to do is take a moment to bring to mind a particular coaching relationship and then see which questions you're drawn to. If there are particular ones that stand out to you and you think, that prompts perhaps a slightly different perspective, pick those, allow them to speak to you for a moment. And then what I'm going to suggest we do, okay, kind of, if it's all right, I think, have we got an even number? We were talking about giving you the opportunity to have a quick conversation in pairs about this.
I'm ready when you are. Just tell me how much time to put on.
Fabulous, thank you. So pick your couple of questions, and then what I'd like you to do is, let's say 5 minutes in your breakout rooms.
Should I open the rooms?
Oh, that would be great. Yes, thank you. So, so Lynn might have stepped away for a moment. Ah, thanks, Lynn. Are we able
I will,
to save the chat from
yes,
this?
I
Fabulous. That would
did.
be good. Welcome back. I know it was a short time. Some of you have got that look that happens when you get evicted from a Zoom room, don't you? It's sort of usually at exactly the point where you're going, that was the thing I was itching to say. There's like so often happens in coaching, often, isn't it? It's the thing that happens just at the very end that is the point we go, that's the bit we want to linger on. So in the interest of time, itching though I am to hear a little bit about some of the things that came up as you were reflecting, I'm going to sort of hit pause on this first perspective, and I'm going to move us now fairly swiftly into the second perspective. So if we think about this kind of tasks, crisis, roles, and practices as in a holistic way, having something to contribute to our understanding of how change happens and how we develop, and that becomes a really useful contribution from understanding adult development theories that we can apply in our coaching reflective practice. Another angle is to raise this question of adult development theories and or even the concept of development itself as potentially being one that might be problematic. So there is far too much text on this slide, and I apologise in advance about it. It's here as much for the fact that it can be something for you to reference post sending the slides out, rather than for you to necessarily read all of it now. But I'm just going to headline a couple of the key things that I think are really relevant and important here. And this may come as no surprise for some of you. That there is a lot of discussion and reflection in the coaching field around what does it mean to think about the application of adult development theories, and what might be some of the challenges of that in our coaching work. So at one level, there may even be disagreement over what do we mean by the term development. Yet the term is regularly used. So as I say, we kind of, it's sort of stitched into almost our workplace environments and the way in which we think about things. And of course, central to this idea of development comes with it the concept of normal. And what does it mean to be normal according to the models or particular theories that are defining the way in which we might describe adult development. So developmental models are therefore normative. So implied in that is sometimes a definition around what is seen as good or bad. So, of course, this can also raise ethical questions. And these ethical questions are prompted in things like, when these are grounded in decontextualized ways of knowing, and there may be kind of certain beliefs, latent beliefs that may be implied in different theories. And those beliefs may disadvantage some people. They may restrict people's access to things like opportunities and power. That all of these elements are really important ethical questions for us when we're thinking about our coaching work. And ethical maturity, of course, as well as wisdom, really requires and emphasizes this way of taking on board a kind of contextualized way in which we know things. And a lot of adult development theories that we may be particularly familiar with are often heavily focused on Western cultural expressions of wisdom, of adult development. And I've flagged a couple of the things here, which I'm sure some of you are already familiar with. So things like gender differences, for example, are often underrepresented. There's criticisms of them being overly reductionistic, so they may be overly simplifying something that is perhaps much messier and much more complex, which may be somewhat useful because it serves a particular purpose and gives us a handle on things. But of course, when we start to mistake the map for the territory, if I use that phrase, this can bring with it some real problems. And this idea of linear hierarchies with universal stages that may be part of this kind of simplification of something that may be focused on parts as opposed to the complex way in which different parts work together. Another aspect of this is this idea of actually, what does it mean as an individual to feel that you are developing? And when we think about the individual lived experience of developing, actually, are those reflected in some of the developmental theories and models that we use to describe development? And in fact, arguably, some of the ways in which we may feel we are developing may even be described in some adult development models as being regression. So how do they sit with that? So this, I think, another important part. Eva's done some really interesting commentary on this in a book I'll flag actually at the end for further reading. But often adult development theories, they're reflecting kind of value-based assumptions. They're rooted in sort of latent historical and sociocultural beliefs. And maybe in trying to predict pathways of development, they maybe unintentionally limit perhaps the very human possibilities that they are arguably setting out to try and describe. So all of these are kind of watch outs maybe, and certainly important ethical reflective questions for us. And then when we think about what does it mean in terms of how we take these theories and apply them, this raises questions around potentially kind of clumsy use or overreaching application or use of some of the theories and models. So, the potential for things like, using them to diagnose. And of course, we know that these are not ways in which we would want to be using adult development theories. And yet, in some ways, these can still show up as kind of frames in which adult development theories are sometimes used. So, and I think when I hook right back to that overarching question that I talked about at the very beginning, and some of the challenges that might raise for us as coachings and the coaching field, is that it perhaps raises the potential for us to focus on adult development theories or see them in some way as being an answer to some of the challenges that we do confront today. And that by focusing on developing, I'm deliberately doing the sort of quotation marks, kind of better people or more developed people, is that the solution? Is that a way in which we can address or help some of the urgent global challenges that we are faced? And I'm not, I'm not saying a no. So but I sort of want to pose some of these things. So of course, these lead us then to a kind of ethical, reflective process, which I think is really important when we're working with adult development. So the second sort of reflective pause exercise that I wanted to pose for you was, I'd like you to take a moment to just think about a particular time where you may have just felt a bit uncomfortable with a piece of developmental work. And I'm going to suggest here from any perspective, because this could be from you as a coach, but it could just as easily be from you being on the receiving end of something that felt like developmental work. It could be in terms of something that's happening in an organization that you work in, or just something you're aware of, but something that's made you feel a little uncomfortable about it. And then when you've picked that situation and brought it to mind, similarly to the last exercise, I'd like you to take a moment and just see one or two of the questions there that you're drawn to. Maybe make a little note of them. Okay. And then we'll pop back into your pairs again, but we might have to shrink it down. I feel so mean doing this. We might have to shrink it down to 4 minutes. So a 4-minute. Thank you. untimely eviction. With because if anything, this one tends to sort of provoke or want, more conversation and chat. But I say, hopefully it's given you enough of a sort of teaser to sort of go away and have some of these questions whirring away a little in your mind post our conversation today. So again, much as I'm itching to delve in and hear a little bit about what did emerge as you started to reflect on it, I know we don't have time for that today. But as I say, I hope it has prompted some further thought for you. So as I said at the beginning, one of the things that obviously I'm not going to do today is try and address or answer the paradox. And one of the challenges is that often when we look at ethical issues and we bring that wisdom perspective to our work, we recognize that paradoxes and tensions are and regularly will arise in the work that we are doing. And what that challenges us to do is to be able to sit with that tension and explore, push and probe into some of the things that sit beneath and drive some of the habits, patterns and ways in which we work, and help us challenge ourselves to reflect on how and why we may be involved in some of the ways in which we may be deceiving ourselves or colluding with some of the problems and systemic issues that we may be facing. And I'm going to finish with this quote from Nora Bateson, which for me, I think is just centrally important when we think about wisdom as that idea of being able, an adaptive capacity that enables us to live and act well in complexity, that this speaks to the complexity within us as well as the complexity around us. And if you have been tempted to delve into some of this a little bit further, there's a couple of books here that I would highly recommend that have some really interesting further thoughts on some of the topics that we've touched on a little bit today. So I will, as I say, send the slides out so you can access those. Thank you very much for your attention and your presence today. I've enormously appreciated the opportunity to be able to share some of this with you all. And as I say, I hope it's been both useful, stimulating, and has perhaps prompted some further reflection as well. So, yes, slides. I will. I'm very happy to share the slides and all the references, etc., at the back as well. So.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for your very informative and thought-provoking webinar today.
My
thanks,
pleasure.
Yeah, to you all for attending. And you're invited through the link to consider registering for our March 1st webinar, same time on March 1st. And also, please complete the survey so we can send you your CCU through the registrar's office at Fielding University. And whatever you provide will be posted so that people can have access to that, Sarah. Thanks again.
Okay. Perfect. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This was amazing.
My pleasure. Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Very well done. Thank you so